think I wasn't recording. Whoops. Let's get started on the skull itself. Okay, so here's the skull. We're still thinking the planar concept. I've had you do work with that. And now we're going to talk about the individual structure. And I've put these terms right here up on the board for you. And I'm going to show you on the skull, and then I'm going to draw it for you. So right here is the orbital cavity. And this is really important because a 1-inch ball sits within that cavity. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that the ball of the eye never grows. So from the time of birth, it's 1 inch in diameter. And it's that way throughout your lifetime. So the eyeball doesn't grow. Now we'll be talking about some other proportions when I talk about the eye. But when you look at this eye in here, across this alignment, you can fit 2 individual irises within that orbital cavity. Okay, so from this intersection of the lacrimal duct to the outer canthus, you can fit 2 irises. And I'll be describing what an iris is at a future lecture. So this is a very important thing to understand the proportions. So I talked about a third, and a third. And the variation between the proportions is not in nose length. And many a drawing is destroyed because of not understanding that. Most often, the proportion that's affected is this proportion on the forehead. My husband and I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he was interviewing one of the curators, and she took us down into kind of the bowels of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And it was really fascinating. She showed us a lot of portraiture done by early American artists. And that portraiture, without a lot of training, I'm sure, but the artists were putting an extraordinarily long nose. And then they'd put the orbital cavity up on the forehead. So it was really interesting to see those portraits. They kind of stayed with me because they were done by great masters of those days, but they were really inaccurate. So that's one thing to consider. So we have a third, and a third. And then I'll break down the other proportions in just a minute. So I want to bring your attention to this little form called the glabella. On the skeleton, or on the skull, you can see this skull has seen a lot of use. I'm going to show you right here. So this is a structure called a keystone. And that keystone is a downturned plane. Now that won't mean anything to you right now, but in the future we're going to be talking about that keystone. So here's that keystone right here of the glabella. And that structure is the start of the nose root on the structure of the skull. So here we have the overall cranium. This is the frontal bone right here. This is the temporalis. This is the temporal bone where that skull turns. So you have a front plane, a side plane, and then a back plane. Okay, and so the skull is 3-dimensional, and if you want portraiture that has complete structure and form, you have to see that and acquire that in your drawings, that structure. We're going to start very architecturally. In other words, we're going to start in the abstract and move on to the organic or specific. George was joking around earlier. He said, what was it about the eyebrows?
What you're going to focus on today, right, is drawing eyebrows. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So, although that was fun. So right here on the frontal bone, which is right here on this drawing, and right here in this section, the important part that I want you to understand is like this planes of the head skull. This actually shows an extra plane change, but the larger plane is a 3-part plane change right here. So it does have a plane change and goes into the superciliar arch, and this is the arch that the brow sits on, is the superciliar arch. It also has a spot right here that's more prominent on the male figure than on the female, and it's called the sinus eminence. So that is one construction line right across that form, and that's important to set up that structure. Otherwise, you'll get it all ski-wampus. You'll have the eyes on one plane, you'll have the nose at another angle, and you get the midline of the mouth, and together they just have this funhouse effect where everything's just slightly distorted, and you don't want that. Okay, so on the side plane, we have this bone, this structure of this bone, and then you have the temporal bone right here. You have this little form right here. I'll show it a little closer. That's called the mastoid process. Now that sits behind your ear. You can reach up and feel it, and it's responsible for sound waves. So someone can occlude their ear and actually get sound waves coming into that ear canal, because that means that it's bouncing off of this. So here we have the orbit, and here we have the only portion of the nose right here that is bone. Okay, so that portion right there is bone, and that's the nasal bone. And that nasal bone, in proportion, is about 1/3 of the length of the nose. So an average nose is 2 inches in length. Okay, so that means that this proportion is about 1/3. So that's the overall length of the nose. So that's an area that you want to make sure that you don't over-exaggerate. So the rest of the nose, 2/3 of that proportion, is cartilage. So cartilage. Okay, so then the ball of the eye sits within this cavity. And when I talk about the eye, I'll actually bring a little 1-inch diameter ball of the eye that sits in this cavity to show you the concept of the eye. But that's the orbit. Now we have, it is a cave-like structure. Notice that it's an overhang, and when you look at that from the side, you can see that the top portion of that, it advances so that the plane of the eyeball sits back. If you were to see this, the ball of the eye sits back at an angle. It doesn't sit within that orbital cavity in a vertical alignment. It sits back in that alignment. So we've got, this is the orbit, this is the infra-orbital ridge right here. So this is where the lower lid sits. Okay, the lower lid has absolutely no movement to it. No movement. So the contour line of your eye when it is shut, or the model's eye, that's your lower infraorbital ridge, or lower lid. Okay, because the movement comes from the levator, which sits above it, the upper lid, and it's called the levator palpebrae. So that upper lid is more of a sphincter-like muscle, and we'll discuss that when I talk about the feature of the eye. At this point, I like to caution everyone, because it's this and this that determines, I just pointed to this and this, that's really what determines lightness. Individual features are always what students want to focus on. They want to do the eyes, the nose, the mouth. But you can leave it in that kind of state for a long time in your drawing until you actually get in and do the features. Because it really is immaterial until later on in the drawing. The features are important, but they do not create lightness. Lightness comes through proportions of length. Lightness comes from an understanding of how those proportions fit within the skull. Okay, so if you've got your proportions on this portion of your drawing correct, then the features kind of fall onto that rather seamlessly, which is really interesting because they fit. And you can really see if your proportion's off, the height, width, and depth at any stage. But in the initial stage, this is a drawing that I did of a model we had here at Slick. And it's really interesting. This is the same concept I started right here. You can't see it now because it's more developed. But that was the initial way that I started this drawing. In the beginning stages of this figure drawing class, you're going to focus on a linear concept for your features. However, around probably the end of October, we're going to switch and it will become more a value decision rather than a decision of line. Okay, so in your sketchbook, I want you to practice some skulls. That's where you're going to get lightness. So just draw as many skulls as you can. Now, getting back to this, this is the nasal aperture. So right here, nasal aperture, right there. And we have two sides segregated or separated by cartilage, and that's called the septum. So this has an individual unique height or opening to the model. And then this point is a key landmark. See this point, the base of the nose? That's what I'm pointing to right there. That is this term right here, the anterior spine of the septum. But it's a major landmark for figuring out the features, how they relate to the form. Okay, so the anterior spine of the septum. That's this point right here that I'm pointing to, right here on the skull. Okay, so underneath that is this non-movable part of the mouth. So mouth starts from right here to the base of the chin. Mouth is not just the colored portion of lip. So this proportion is a third right here to here. Okay, get my finger out of the way. That's a third. Okay, so when you break down that third, then you get 2/3 of the way down on your midline, you get what's called the midline of the mouth. Okay, and that's 2/3 the distance from the base of the nose to the bottom of the chin. 2/3. Okay? Important proportions. I'll give you a second to catch up. The bottom lip, the bottom portion of the colored portion of the lip, that proportion is 1/2. So it's 1/2 to here, 1/2 to here from the bottom portion of the lip. And we'll develop that more as I talk about the individual feature. Today we're just talking about the structure of the skull, and then I'll talk about the musculature. So next, on this maxilla, depends on where you are in the United States, how you say it. I've heard it pronounced maxilla on the East Coast, maxilla here. So I'm just going to say maxilla for you, okay? And I hope that that is something you can understand. But it's the non-movable portion of the mouth. It's attached to the skull. Now we're going to talk about this form right here. This is the movable portion of the skull. This is where you get all your expression for the mouth comes in this section. So this is the mandible. It has a two-part plane change right here. It changes right on these important corners right here. Okay? And then the back of this is called the ramus. And this ramus is all part of this mandible. Okay? And you can see it. Well, that was a good idea. Break the skull. Hey, that was not part of the demonstration, but you can see that this is the movable portion of that form. So this is the ramus. It applies to a term back in the Roman period, the Greek forum that was named after a Greek legend, Remus and Romulus. And this portion of this ramus is called the wolf. Isn't that interesting? The wolf. I like that. I don't know, for some reason that just helps me to remember these terms a little easier. All right, next we have, these are all the landmarks that you're going to need to know. Here's some of the proportions again. A third to the widow's peak, right here. Where the hair ends is called the widow's peak. So that's how you take the measurement for the skull to the superciliar arch. And right there to right there, you can see this form right here is the sinus eminence. And if you have someone that's balding, then you take the measurement at the top of the skull, okay? And otherwise, this is the widow's peak right here. Then you get a third and a third. Now, in this drawing portion, this is what I would like you to know about this skull. So, the halfway point right here in profile is the auditory meatus. This is a fancy word for your ear canal. And it sits right there. But proportionally, you know right there is the halfway point when the skull is in profile. So that means that the front of the ear is sitting slightly forward of that. But this is a very common error you can see in a lot of drawings, is they'll place the ear either in front of or behind that form, and that's not correct. So then, I've talked about the orbital cavity. This is a really, really important measurement. So your tear duct, the correct terminology is the lacrimal duct. If you remember one thing today about today's lecture, this is the anatomical center. For the skull. So here is the high point of the skull. The high point, by the way, is not right here on the widow's peak. The high point is right here on the parietal. So right there on the parietal. Okay, so that measurement is taking, so the lacrimal duct right here is where your tears are produced, one of the places, and it's half here to here and half here to here. Now, Can someone think of a way that that might be impacted? How would that be changed? Any ideas? What?
You said that, where was it again? That you're doing?
It's the anatomical center.
Uh-huh.
What impacts that is it can be impacted by eye level.
Uh-huh.
So if the model's on the stand and standing, that creates, you're looking at the model above eye level, then you're going to have less proportions of length here to here and see more to here and underneath the chin. If you're sitting with that model at eye level, then that would be equal. Here to here to here, okay? So very, very important landmark, that lacrimal duct. All right, the side plane of this bone is called the zygomatic. Right here we have the zygomatic bone, and it's a two-part plane change. Okay, so zygomatic bone, zygomatic arch. And the arch actually sits on the side plane of the skull. Okay, so it actually, here's the process of the zygomatic, here's the bone, and right where your glasses would change planes, like right here on my glasses, right that point, that's where this is front plane, this is side plane. So that's where that's going to switch places. Okay? So now, this comes, the zygomatic bone comes up into this temporal ridge right here. That's the side plane of the orbital cavity. And the back plane of this skull, right here, is basically flat in this section right here. It has a bump right here that I've mentioned before. That bump is called the occiput. Isn't that fun to say? I just think it's fun to say, occiput. So that's where that nuchal ligament and the trapezius originate right here, on one of the places that it originates. So this is a flat spot right here. Now, when a baby is born, for the first year of life, mothers and fathers are really careful about rotating the skull of the infant, because this can become, if they just put that baby on the flat surface, it can become overly flat. This is a unique feature to us as a mammal that other mammals do not have. So I think that's kind of fascinating as well. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the musculature of this skull. This is the really fun stuff. All right, now it's very simple. The muscles of the form are easy to understand. And I'm going to start talking to you about them. So this is the temporalis. And you can see that that's what's creating this three-part plane change on the skull. Now, as far as thickness, this is something interesting to understand. On other places of the human form, it is very thick, the muscle tissue. But on the face, there is very little thickness to those muscles. So right here, this is the frontalis. Muscles only pull. So its main function is to elevate the eye, the brow. And you can see the direction of these muscle fibers. It's bifurcated in the center, and it will get, as someone ages, creases right here to here. Okay, next we have the musculature that surrounds the cavity of the eye. So right here, this is the orbicularis oculi. And it is a sphincter-like muscle. We have 7 sphincter muscles on the human form. Bet you didn't know that, right? Bring that out at a party. That would be really fun.
Your eyes are sphincters.
What?
Your eyes are sphincters.
That's right. That's right. So you have lovely sphincters on your eyes, right? That's a good pickup line. So here is the little tail end of that orbicularis oculi. And we have 2 muscles that are named that. We have orbicularis oris, which is this sphincter-like muscle, and this one. Anytime you see anything associated in anatomy that says oculi, that deals with the eye. Anything you see that's labeled oris deals with the mouth. Okay, so it has this little tail-like form that comes off that muscle right here, and it's called the procerus. All of these are in your book, by the way. So this compresses your eyelid. So here's the midline of the eye. Here's the levator palpebrae, ending in this tear duct. And this pulls up. Okay, pulls the lid up. Most of the expression when we're drawing from the model takes place in the eye, right? That's where we want the center of focus to be for our drawings. Mostly it takes place right there. So this is the orbicularis oris, and this is the oculi. Now this little tail sits under a muscle that's responsible for a lot of expression. It is a levator muscle, and it's called the corrugator. So that's the term right there, corrugator. And it has a function. It has one movement. And that movement is to pull the brow upward. So it goes that direction. Okay? And it's bilateral, so we have 2 of those muscles. Now, this is the muscle of the nasalis, and I've got it in yellow so you can see that distinction. It goes up and over the nose bone. So the nasal bone right here, that nasalis goes up over the top plane. But it's thin. So just like this temporalis, comparing that, it's like when you think of how much thickness that would have, it would be taking a very small amount of butter on toast. It's that thin. Okay, so when it bundles, that's when you get creases in the forehead. Now this nasalis, it comes up and over, and then it comes down on the side plane. Now, one time I had a student ask me what created movement in the nostril. And the nostril we'll get to when we talk about the nose. But it has 2 little points of attachment, and it's a little strap. And one of the straps comes down to here, and one of the straps comes, so it sits right here on the nostril, and one of the straps wraps around and inserts onto the anterior spine of the septum. So that's what's creating when you see a nostril flare, which you can't right now because we've all got masks on, but that's what's creating that movement, is that 2 different points of attachment. Okay, now on this chart you can see, and I'll do it over here so you can see this easily. If you think about these 2 muscles, they're about the thickness of a rubber band. Okay, so really quite thin muscles. You have the zygomatic minor here, the zygomatic major. And that major has a front plane axis and wraps around the zygomatic bone. It attaches right here, called the node. That's fun to say too. So this node is a very important function of the mouth. The muscles, the orbicularis oris, has nothing that it attaches to on the skull. It's free floating. It's the only case that I know of on the skull where a muscle doesn't have a point of attachment to bone. So I'm sure there's others, but this, to my knowledge, is one that impacts us as artists. So here's the node. We've got the zygomatic minor, zygomatic major attaching to that node. We have a group that is called the quadrates. And that's all I'm going to ask you to remember is the quadrates. Oh, I didn't put down a major one. So it's a triangular-like form right here. Okay, that's the quadrates. And what these muscles do is they're depressors. So they're responsible for expressions where you frown. Okay, takes 37 muscles to smile. It takes less to frown. So this is the quadrates. To the side of this back here, we have this major muscle called the masseter. Now, as far as thickness, this is a thick muscle. And that muscle is about 2 centimeters thick. It wraps down around here on the ramus, and it comes up underneath the zygomatic arch, and it attaches right here. So it originates right here on the top of the skull, in the temporal ridge. So if you've been clenching your jaw, it's a lot better without my mask on to show you that, but if you're clenching your jaw, that muscle bundles. You'll see that. So when someone is angry, that muscle is really thick. I don't watch a lot of television, but if you've seen any of the politics going on right now, this isn't a political discussion, but when people get very heated about or passionate about their subjects, you'll see that muscle at work. It's a chewing muscle. So when someone, if you're sitting at a restaurant or sitting with family and friends, notice that muscle. You can see that very evident in the skull. Okay, so that's the masseter muscle. And then this is responsible for pulling the jaw or the mandible up. Okay, so this side muscle, the temporalis, pulls that way out of the oblique. And then we have this huge cord. And this is really a muscle of the neck, but I put it in here because it impacts us a lot visually. This muscle originates here on the mastoid process behind the ear, and it does an S-curve around that form to here, and it attaches right here, and it has 2 points of attachment. So it has tendons that come off of that, and one of the tendons attaches on the manubrium and one on the clavicle. And I'll have George show you this because you can see this really well on George when he's modeling. When you go like that, put a lot of stress and tension in your neck, you can see that very well. So this is a long, thick muscle. You can feel it on your own neck. When you're in profile, it's vertical. When you turn it all, it becomes this S-curve. Okay? Now, I was going to start into the feature of the ear, but I think this will be it for today. This is a lot of information to cover, and I want you to have time time with the model. So let's go back to our stations, please. I've invited George. Thank you.